They called her the family's shame. Too plain, too quiet, too ordinary for any decent man to look twice at. So when her sisters filled out the mail-order bride application as nothing more than a cruel joke, not one of them imagined what would happen next. The rancher who opened that envelope in Missoula, Montana, wasn't looking for perfection. He'd already been burned by a woman who was perfect on paper and empty underneath. He wanted truth. And the sister they sent to humiliate him, the one nobody in that house ever chose first, was about to become the only woman he'd ever choose again. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a joke turned into a life, you have to understand the house Norah Bennett grew up in. It sat 2 miles outside town, a farmhouse with a wraparound porch her father had built with his own hands the year he married, back when he still believed the daughters God gave him would all turn out the same kind of beautiful as their mother. Vivian came first, golden-haired and certain of her place in every room she entered. Caroline came next, sharper, quicker to laugh at someone else's expense than to defend them. Margaret came third, sweet-voiced and cruel in the way only a woman raised to compete for attention can be cruel. Norah came last, and by the time she arrived, her father had already stopped expecting anything remarkable. She was not ugly, whatever her sisters said in front of company and behind closed doors alike. She had her mother's plain brown hair and her father's stubborn jaw, and neither of those things photographed well in a family that prized golden curls and delicate chins. What she had instead was a steadiness nobody in that house valued, a way of finishing what she started, a habit of noticing when someone else was hurting even while nursing her own bruises. She mended the household's clothes without complaint, kept the ledgers when her father's eyes grew too tired for numbers, and absorbed her sister's jokes with a quiet that they mistook for weakness rather than the discipline of someone who had learned, very young, that arguing back only made the laughter louder. The evening it started was like 100 evenings before it. Vivian had found a newspaper advertisement, the kind that circulated through farming towns that summer, promising eligible men out west were desperate enough to write to anyone who'd have them. She read it aloud at the parlor table by lamplight, her voice climbing with delight at every detail. A widower, 36 years old, owner of a cattle operation in Wyoming Territory that, according to their father's business associates, was worth a genuine fortune. Seeking a woman of gentle nature and modest beauty for marriage, serious inquiries only. Caroline snatched the paper before Vivian had even finished, already composing the letter in her head, already picturing herself installed in some grand ranch house with servants and land as far as the eye could see. But greed makes people careless, and vanity makes them worse. None of the 3 Golden sisters wanted to actually go. Wyoming Territory in 1887 was not a place a woman like Vivian pictured herself ending up, however grand the fortune attached to it. It was cold, it was far, and worst of all, it required leaving behind the admiring eyes of every young man in Missoula who already knew their names. So the joke took shape slowly, the way cruelty in that house always did, dressed up as fun before anyone admitted what it really was. Send Norah instead. Fill out the application in her name. Attach no photograph. Let the rancher discover on his own doorstep exactly what kind of woman his advertisement had actually caught. Norah heard the plan before they meant her to. She was sitting near the window with her mending, staying just out of sight the way she'd learned to do years earlier. When a person's presence in a room only invited unkindness, she'd rather not witness firsthand. Vivian cleared her throat theatrically and read the advertisement again for the others, savoring each word like a woman rehearsing a stage performance. Rancher seeking bride, gentle nature, modest beauty, strong character for marriage, must be willing to relocate. She paused for effect, the way she always did before delivering something designed to wound. Can you imagine? She said. The man's probably ancient and desperate for anyone at all. With a ranch that size, Caroline said, Father heard about the Roar Creek operation from his business associates. This man is supposedly worth a fortune, cattle, land, everything. The real question, Vivian said, letting her voice drop into something colder, is who should we send him? The silence that followed made Norah's stomach turn cold, because she already knew, the way a person always knows the shape of a blow before it lands. You're not thinking, Margaret said, though her tone suggested she was thinking of exactly the same thing. "Oh, but I am," Vivian answered, and her words dripped with something Norah recognized from a lifetime of being on the receiving end of it. Dear, sweet, unfortunate Norah, 24 years old and never been courted, father's greatest disappointment, the daughter who inherited mother's plain hair and father's stubborn jaw instead of any of the Bennett beauty. Vivian, that's cruel even for you, Margaret said, but she was already laughing before the sentence finished, and that laughter told Norah everything about how the vote would go. They filled out the application in her name that same night, giggling over which details to embellish and which to leave dangerously honest. They mailed it the following morning before their father woke, and for 3 weeks the household treated the whole affair as an entertaining secret, something to whisper about at supper when their parents weren't listening. Norah said nothing to stop them, because in that house, saying something never stopped anything. It only handed her sisters a fresh target. She went about her chores, she mended dresses, she kept the ledgers, and she told herself the rancher would never write back, that men who owned fortunes did not choose the daughter nobody else wanted, not even as a joke worth pursuing to its conclusion. She was wrong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early September, addressed plainly to Miss Norah Bennett, and when her father handed it to her at the breakfast table, her sisters went so quiet you could hear the clock in the hallway ticking. The rancher's name was Thomas Calloway, and his letter was nothing like what any of them expected from a desperate, ancient widower. It was short, direct, and entirely without the flowery courtship language advertisements like his usually inspired. He wrote that he did not need a wife who could recite poetry or arrange flowers. He had buried one of those already and learned what that kind of beauty cost a man when the winters got hard. He wrote that he needed someone steady, someone who would not flinch at frost on the inside of the windows or the smell of a birthing barn at 2 in the morning. He asked her, if she was willing, to write back and tell him one true thing about herself that nobody else would think to mention in a letter meant to impress a stranger. Her sisters wanted her to write back with a lie so elaborate it would end the joke immediately, something so absurd Calloway would withdraw his interest the moment he read it. Norah sat at the desk that night with her sister's suggestions ringing in her ears, and then she set down her pen and wrote something else entirely. She told him she had never once in her life been asked what she thought about anything, only what she looked like, and that she had stopped minding the second part so long as nobody expected the first. She sealed the letter before she could talk herself out of it, walked it to the post office herself the next morning, and did not tell her sisters a word of what she'd written. The correspondence that followed spanned nearly 2 months, and something in it began to change the temperature of that house entirely. Calloway wrote back within 2 weeks, and his second letter was longer than his first, less guarded, curious in a way that surprised even Norah. He told her about the ranch, 3,000 head of cattle across land that stretched further than a person could walk in a day, about the wife he'd lost to fever 4 years earlier, about a daughter, 6 years old, who barely remembered her mother's face and had stopped asking about her sometime last spring, which worried him more than if she'd kept asking. He told her he did not want another wife who would look at that ranch and see only the fortune attached to it, because he had married once for exactly the wrong reasons and did not intend to make the same mistake twice. Norah wrote back honestly, more honestly than she had ever written to anyone, because there was a strange freedom in confiding truths to a man 3 territories away who had no way of using them against her at supper. She told him about the ledgers she kept, about the way she could read a person's mood by the pace of their footsteps on the stairs, about her fear that she had spent so many years disappearing into corners that she had forgotten how to be seen. Calloway's replies grew warmer with each exchange, and by October, when he proposed formally by letter and asked her to come west before winter closed the passes, her sisters had stopped laughing entirely, because whatever had begun as their cruelest joke had somehow become the one thing in that house nobody quite knew how to mock anymore. Their father agreed to the marriage with an eagerness that stung Norah more than she let herself admit, less concern for her happiness than relief at one fewer daughter to provide for, one less mouth at a table that had grown tight with debts he hid from his wife and daughters both. Her mother wept at the train station, though whether from genuine sorrow or the performance her sisters had taught her to expect from such occasions, Norah could not entirely say. Vivian did not come to see her off at all. Caroline offered a stiff embrace and a warning about frostbite that felt more like an insult than a farewell. Margaret alone lingered at the platform's edge, and just before the train pulled away, she pressed a small folded note into Nora's palm. Whispering an apology she did not have the courage to say aloud. An apology Nora would not read until the train was hours gone, and the fields of Missouri had given way to unfamiliar country. The journey west took the better part of a week, and Nora spent most of it watching the landscape change through a window streaked with soot, the gentle farmland of home giving way to something rougher, wider, more indifferent to a single woman's fear. She had never traveled further than the county seat before. She had never slept in a place she couldn't name, never eaten a meal she hadn't cooked or watched be cooked, never sat this long with nothing but her own thoughts and a stranger's letters for company. She read Calloway's letters again on that train until the paper softened at the folds, searching each line for some hidden evidence of the disappointment she was certain awaited her, some clue that a man who owned that much land and cattle would take one look at her plain hair and stubborn jaw and send her straight back east on the next available train. The station at the end of the line was smaller than she expected, a single platform and a depot building with paint peeling in long strips from the wind. She stepped down from the train with her single trunk and stood there in the cold, watching men in heavy coats load and unload freight, none of them paying her any particular attention, until a tall figure separated himself from the shadow of the depot and walked toward her with a deliberateness that told her immediately who he was. Thomas Calloway was not the ancient, desperate figure her sisters had joked about. He was perhaps 10 years older than her, weathered by sun and work in a way that had carved lines into his face without stealing anything essential from it. And when he stopped in front of her, he did not smile the polite, practiced smile of a man greeting a stranger. He studied her for a long moment. The way she imagined, he studied a fence line for weakness before trusting it to hold cattle through a storm. "I expected someone taller," he said finally, and it took Nora a moment to realize he was teasing her, because nobody in her life had ever teased her gently before, only cruelly. She managed something close to a laugh, surprised at the sound of it, and told him she'd been told the same thing her whole life about several other qualities she apparently lacked. Something shifted in his expression then, something that looked almost like relief, as though he had been braced for a woman who arrived expecting a fortune and instead found one who arrived expecting to be sent home. He loaded her trunk onto the wagon himself, refusing the help of the station hand who offered, and as they rode out toward the ranch through country so open it made her chest ache with something she didn't have a word for yet, he told her, without her asking, exactly why he had written back to her letter and none of the others that summer's advertisement had drawn. There had been others, he admitted, women whose letters promised elegance and grace and a beauty that would do credit to a man of his standing, and every one of those letters had made him more certain he was about to repeat the exact mistake that had cost him 4 years of grief he still hadn't finished carrying. His first wife had married him for the ranch, he said plainly, watching the road ahead rather than her face as he spoke, and had spent every year of their marriage reminding him, in small ways and large, that she'd settled for less than she deserved. When she died, he told Nora, he had grieved the loss of a partnership more than the loss of the woman herself, and that shame had sat in him for years, a debt he owed a person who was no longer alive to collect it. "Your letter," he said, "was the only one that didn't try to convince me you were something you weren't. That's worth more out here than beauty. Beauty doesn't get you through a Wyoming winter." The ranch house, when it finally came into view, was larger and plainer than Nora had imagined, built for function rather than show, and standing on the porch steps was a small girl with dark hair escaping its braid, watching the approaching wagon with the wary stillness of a child who had learned not to hope too openly for anything good. This was Emma, Calloway's daughter, 6 years old and carrying a grief too large for her small frame. And when Nora climbed down from the wagon and knelt to meet her, at eye level rather than towering over her the way adults usually did, something in the girl's careful expression cracked just slightly. Nora did not reach for her, did not force affection where none had been earned yet. She simply said hello and asked if Emma might show her around later, once she'd had a chance to put her things away, and the girl nodded once, still cautious, but no longer quite so braced. The first months on the ranch were not the fairy tale Nora's sisters would have imagined if they'd bothered to imagine anything beyond their own amusement. Winter came hard and early that year, and Norah learned quickly that the skills that had made her invisible in her father's house, the steadiness, the competence, the refusal to complain, were the exact skills that kept a ranch household running through months when the roads disappeared under snow and the nearest neighbor was an hour's ride away in good weather. She learned to manage the household accounts alongside the ranch ledgers, and Calloway, watching her work through the numbers one evening by lamplight, admitted he had not seen anyone handle figures with that kind of ease since he'd taken over the operation from his own father years before. Slowly, without either of them naming it directly, something between them shifted from a business arrangement into something that resembled partnership, and then, by late winter, into something that resembled the beginning of tenderness neither of them had expected to find again. But comfort, Norah had learned long ago, rarely arrived without something trailing behind it to unsettle it, and this particular comfort was no exception. In February, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed not to Norah but to Thomas Calloway directly, and the handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Vivian's, elegant and confident even in ink. Norah recognized it the moment she saw it sitting on the hall table, and her stomach dropped in a way that told her, before she even knew the contents, that whatever her sister had written was not meant kindly. Calloway read the letter alone in his study that evening, and when he emerged, his face carried an expression Norah had not seen on him before, something guarded, something newly uncertain, and he did not offer to show her what the letter said, which frightened her more than if he had simply handed it over. It took 3 days before he told her what Vivian had written, 3 days during which the warmth between them cooled into something careful and formal, 3 days that felt to Norah like watching a life she'd only just begun to trust slip quietly back out of reach. When he finally spoke, standing at the study window with his back half turned toward her, he told her that Vivian's letter had painted the entire marriage as a scheme, had suggested that the Bennett family had sent their least desirable daughter specifically to secure his fortune through marriage before he discovered how little she truly had to offer, and had hinted, cruelly and without any apparent guilt, that Norah's quiet nature concealed calculation rather than simple reserve. "She's lying," Norah said immediately, her voice steadier than she felt, and she told him everything then, the whole story from the beginning, the joke that had never been meant to succeed, the letter she'd written out of nothing but honesty because she'd had nothing else to offer a stranger 3 territories away. Calloway listened without interrupting, and when she finished, the silence in the room stretched long enough that Norah feared she had said too much, revealed too plainly the shame at the center of her own family. But then he turned from the window, and the guardedness had gone out of his face, replaced by something that looked almost like anger, though not directed at her. He told her that a woman capable of concocting a scheme wouldn't have needed 3 months of honest letters to secure a marriage, that Vivian's accusation revealed far more about the sister who'd written it than about the one it was meant to condemn, and that he had suspected as much the moment he finished reading it, but had needed to hear the truth from Norah's own mouth before he let himself trust his instinct completely. "I should have told you the moment it arrived," he admitted, instead of letting 3 days pass in silence like a coward. "I'm sorry for that." The relief of that reconciliation might have been the end of the story if this were a simpler kind of tale, but trouble on a ranch that size rarely announces itself only once. That same spring, a man named Silas Whitfield arrived at Roar Creek claiming a decades-old dispute over the boundary line between his family's land and Calloway's, a dispute Norah quickly realized had less to do with fence posts and surveys than with a long-standing grudge Whitfield's father had carried against Calloway's father before either of them were born. Whitfield brought forged documents to the Territorial Land Office, claiming a portion of Calloway's most valuable grazing land had been improperly recorded decades earlier, and for several tense weeks that spring, Calloway faced the very real possibility of losing a piece of the ranch his own grandfather had first claimed from the open range. Norah, whose years of managing her father's household ledgers had taught her far more about reading documents carefully than anyone in that Wyoming courthouse expected from a rancher's new wife, spent long nights poring over the old land records Calloway kept in a strongbox in his study, cross-referencing dates and survey markers until she found the inconsistency that finally broke the case wide open. Whitfield's forged documents referenced a surveyor who, according to the territorial records Norah tracked down through careful correspondence with the land office, had not actually been licensed to conduct surveys until 2 years after the date claimed on Whitfield's paperwork. It was a small detail, the kind of thing an exhausted judge might have overlooked entirely. But Norah's patience and her stubborn refusal to accept an answer that didn't fully make sense uncovered it. And when she presented her findings to Calloway, he brought them before the territorial judge himself, and Whitfield's claim collapsed within a single afternoon of testimony. Word of what Norah had done spread through the territory faster than either of them expected, and by summer, the woman her own sisters had once called too plain and too ordinary for any decent man's attention had become, without ever seeking the reputation, known throughout the county as the rancher's wife with a mind sharper than most men's and a steadiness nobody dared underestimate twice. Emma, who had watched the entire ordeal with the quiet attentiveness children bring to matters they only half understand, began that summer calling Norah something other than her name for the first time, a small, tentative word that meant more to both of them than either said aloud. And Norah found herself crying over it later that evening in a way that had nothing to do with sorrow. News of the Whitfield case, and of the marriage itself, eventually made its way back to Missouri, carried through the kind of correspondence networks that connected respectable families across even great distances, and it reached the Bennett household precisely as Norah's sisters were beginning to feel the tightening pressure of their father's hidden debts that had grown considerably worse in the years since Norah's departure. Vivian, who had once dismissed the entire marriage as a joke not worth taking seriously, wrote to Norah that autumn for the first time since her cruel letter to Calloway, and this new letter carried none of its predecessor's confidence. She wrote asking, carefully and without quite admitting to the request outright, whether the rancher's wife, who had apparently become quite comfortable in Wyoming Territory, might consider a loan substantial enough to help settle their father's most pressing obligations. Norah sat with that letter for a long time before showing it to Thomas, remembering every evening she'd spent invisible at the edge of her family's parlor, every joke made at her expense, every year she'd absorbed her sister's cruelty, because arguing back had only ever made things worse. She thought about Margaret's whispered apology at the train station, the only kindness any of her sisters had offered her in the entirety of that final week, and she thought about Vivian's letter to Calloway, written with such casual, devastating cruelty that it had nearly cost Norah the one partnership in her life that had ever asked her to be exactly who she was. When she finally showed the letter to Thomas, he told her the decision belonged entirely to her, that whatever she chose, he would stand behind it without judgment, because he had learned by then that Norah's steadiness came paired with a fairness he had rarely encountered in anyone, family or otherwise. She wrote back to her sisters that autumn, not with cruelty, because cruelty had never been the language she wanted to speak, but with a clarity that surprised even her as she composed it. She would help their father settle his debts, she wrote, because he was still her father and because she had the means to do so without hardship to her own household. But she would not do it silently, and she would not do it as though the years of humiliation had never happened. She asked only one thing in return, that the next time a Bennett daughter sat at that parlor table considering someone plain, someone quiet, someone easily overlooked, they remember what quiet competence had built for the sister they'd once mailed off as nothing more than a joke, and that they extend to whoever sat at the edge of that room next the kindness none of them had thought to extend to her. The money was sent, the debts were settled, and the following spring, Vivian traveled west for the first time in her life, ostensibly to thank her sister in person, though Norah suspected curiosity played as large a role as gratitude. What Vivian found at Roar Creek Ranch was not the desperate, isolated existence she had once imagined for the sister she'd pitted and mocked in equal measure, but a household run with quiet competence, a marriage built on something far sturdier than the beauty and charm Vivian herself had always relied upon, and a little girl who ran across the yard calling Norah's name with an openness that startled Vivian into a silence she rarely experienced. She stayed only a week, but it was long enough for something between the sisters to shift, not into closeness exactly, that would take years neither of them had yet lived, but into something honest enough to build on, which was more than either of them had managed in 24 years under the same roof. Emma grew up on that ranch calling Norah Mama by the time she turned 8, and by the time the century turned, Roar Creek had expanded under Norah's careful management of its ledgers into one of the most respected operations in that stretch of Wyoming Territory, known as much for the fairness of its dealings as for the size of its herds. Thomas Calloway would say, whenever anyone asked him how he'd found a wife willing to leave everything she knew for a stranger's letter and an uncertain future, that he hadn't found her so much as recognized her, in the single honest sentence of a letter that owed nothing to beauty and everything to truth. And Norah, when she told the story herself in later years, always insisted the joke her sisters played on her that summer evening was the finest gift any of them had ever given her, whether they'd intended it as one or not, because it had sent her toward the one place in the world where being exactly herself, plain hair, stubborn jaw, unglamorous steadiness and all, turned out to be more than enough. If this story moved you the way it moved us to tell it, stay close, because we have more true tales of overlooked women who found their place waiting for them further west than anyone expected, and we'll be sharing the next one soon.